Hey, well, look to the person beside you and go ahead and tell them good morning. Do that for me for just a moment. Tell them good morning and that you're glad to see them. I want to welcome those who are watching online through social media or through our app or some other way through Facebook, whatever it may be. I want to welcome all of you and say we're excited to have you this morning and we're excited to be here. How many of you guys had a good time for the 4th of July? Did anybody celebrate 4th of July, eat too much, any of that stuff? All right, you got to enjoy time with your family and friends. That's always good. I'm so thankful for Pastor Andrew preaching last week. Didn't he do a good job last week sharing the gospel? And we have, God's gifted us with a lot of talented people. And Pastor Andrew, thank you for preaching last week. And my family was able to get away for a few days and go on vacation and spend some time together. And also during that time, we also went and took Braden back to the doctor and to get a follow-up with. Many of you know what has been going on with him, and so we got a good report this week. We went back to the doctor. He hasn't had any seizures since the episodes that we had when we were sent over to Augusta, and so we went for a follow-up. And the good news, there's some good news to it, is that because he's not had another seizure, we're going to go another 6 months. We'll follow up again as long as there's no seizures. We'll go another 6 months, and at that point, if there's been no seizures, we'll reduce the medication to half, and then we'll also do an EEG at that time. If everything seems to be fine, we'll go to half, and then 6 months later, he'll be able to come off medication completely. With that being said, we're also having to monitor, we'll have to continue to do some MRIs to monitor the arachnoid cyst. He said right now, everything's fine. If it doesn't grow anymore, he could keep it for the rest of his life. But if it does grow anymore, then we'll have to do something about that. And so that is something, so for the next few years, that'll be just something we monitor. So we're asking a lot of questions, right? We're like, hey, what can we do? What can we not do? And he's like, everything's good. I was like, can he lift weights? You know, he wants to lift weights. Can he do that? He's like, yeah, lift weights is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And if he gets to that age, that's what he wants to do. I was like, what about roller coasters? Can he get on roller coasters? He's like, yeah, that's fine. And so I went through all these questions, like, what can he do? What can he not do? And I was like, can he fly? And he stopped and he looked at me and said, no. And I was like, what? Like, everything was good until this point. I was like, can he get in a plane? He was like, no, he can't fly. I was like, well, why can't he fly? He said, he's too young to fly. And I realized at that point, he realized I was asking, can he get in the plane and fly the plane? And I was like, no, that's not what I'm asking. He was like, are you meaning commercial or for, leisure for yourself? I was like, no, I was like, can he get in a plane? Can he be elevated? Is it okay, because of the pressure and all? He's like, no, he's fine. He just can't fly the plane, okay? Just don't let him fly. I was like, no, that's all I was asking is, can he fly? And so we leave and we call because his brother and sister were staying with my wife's parents. And so we called and he's like, they said I could live seizure free or live my life without seizures. Well, Bentley gets on the phone and starts crying. She's emotional. She's a hot mess. She's like, what do you mean he said that you could live without a sister? He's like, no, I didn't say that I could live without a sister. I can live my life without seizures. But all she heard was that the doctor said you could live without a sister. So she thought she was done, like he was going to get rid of her. It was like, no, she's good. So we had some entertainment along the way with it. But we're thankful for a good report, and we're thankful for your prayers through that process. And we're just praying for the next few months that he continues to do well, and then we're able to slowly get him off the medicine and then just monitor the arachnoid cyst. And so, again, I just want to say thank you from our family for your prayers through that time, and God's definitely had his hand on us and continues to in that process. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to the book of Luke chapter 15. I'm going to give you a couple of different verses elsewhere, but mainly Luke 15 is where we will be. So if you want to turn there to follow along, you can. We've been asking the question, what's next? Been looking at a lot of spiritual things, self-evaluation, preparing ourselves, what's next for my life? What is it that God wants me to do? And really getting ready. So this morning, we're going to kind of start turning the ship in a different direction and start talking about, hey, what are some things we need to do? And one of the things, our church does really well at this, and this is what we're going to talk about today, but I think we do really well as a church at reaching out in our community and inviting people and sharing the gospel in a way of inviting people to come back to church and to be with us, to be exposed and to experience the gospel and the preaching and the worship and all of those things. So I think we do well with it, but it's also should be a time that we're reminded as we get ready for the fall. Believe it or not, the cooler weather will get here, right? Sooner or later, fall will be here. We'll set in and you go through, football comes and all of those things. The fall is just a great time of the year and a great time to start inviting people to come be a part of what we're doing and inviting them to church. And so we want to be able to do that. And so I want us to talk for just a few minutes out of Luke 15. And we're going to look at a little bit, not really a whole lot, because I've preached on the prodigal son before. But I want to take just a few moments in that to talk about as we reach out, as we search, as we invite people and invite them to hear the gospel, invite them to and build relationships with them and what that looks like. So in Luke 15, verses 1 and 2 in the NIV translation, it says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him." This is Jesus teaching, right? And they would gather around. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, what were they doing? Muttering. How many of you know somebody that likes to mutter around a little bit? Just raise your hand. As we say every week, just don't throw elbows, right? They like to mutter. This man welcomes sinners and he eats with them. Now, what they were essentially saying is, no wonder he's successful at bringing the crowd. Why? Because he welcomes sinners and he eats with them. He's welcoming the lost. He allows them to come in. He's no different than they are. No wonder the church is growing, or no wonder there's people gathering together. No wonder, because the man welcomes sinners and he eats with them. So they were criticizing him. But what did he say in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 12? There's a passage there. It says this, is that it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the who? But the sick. He goes on and he says, "I have not come to call the righteous, but who?" He says, "I've come to call the sinners. I've come to call those who are broken. I've come to reach out to those who are hurting." So Jesus spent a majority of his ministry with the people who were outside of the religious world, who were outside of religion, who were outside, that were broken, that were far from God. He spent a majority of his ministry reaching out to them, reaching out to the lost, to seek and to save those that are lost, to seek and save those that are far from him. You find that lost people were his number one priority. It was reaching out to people who didn't know him. And we as a church, it's one of our priorities. Our very first t-shirt, some of you may still have it. In fact, there's a couple, I think Vaughn or Lisa, some of you may have it. I think we still have one at the house. But our very first t-shirt we created as a church when we started, it just said reach across the front of it. It's talking about reaching. We're a church that needs to reach the lost. Be reminded that it's not about us. And as a church, we need to get back to those things as we're reminded it's not about us, but it's about reaching the lost. It's God using us and the gifts that we have to go and reach those who have yet to know him. And so remember this story of the prodigal son. While he was telling this story, who was he around? The tax collectors. He was around the sinners. He's around them, but yet when he tells this story, who was he addressing? He was addressing the muttering. He was addressing the religious leaders who were muttering in the background. They were whispering. They were talking. Who does he think he is? Here he is fellowshipping with the sinners and the tax collectors. Who does he think he is gathering around them? And that's who Jesus was directing his story to in Luke 15. It was to the muttering. And I don't believe that it was him, as he was telling the story, that it was him defending himself or defending his ministry. But I think this story is part of him defining the purpose of his church, defining the purpose of what he was all about. It wasn't he was defending those that were talking against him, but it was the fact that he was defining who he was and defining what we as a church are to be about. So Jesus tells the story, right? The story of the lost sheep. He tells the story of the lost coin. And then he goes on and tells the story of the lost boy who took, all that he had and he got from his dad, and he went out and he spent it and he blew it and lived in sin. And this whole build up to this point, this whole discourse comes to this point where the prodigal son comes back home after he's went off and spent all of his resources, everything that he has, and finally he come to himself and realized, man, I've made a mistake. And he comes back. And his dad is so happy. What does he say? Hey, bring me a robe, bring me a ring, kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a party. My son is here. My son is home, and we need to celebrate, right? Get the piñatas out. We're going to bring all the kids, bring everybody over, man. We're going to have a big party. My son has come home, and we need to celebrate, and we need to feast together. But then in chapter 15, or in verse 25 and following, you find that word, meanwhile. Now, anytime you hear the word meanwhile, it's like, while this was going on and this was good, meanwhile, something else is happening, right? Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and the dancing. And so he called out to one of the servants and he asked him, hey, what's going on? Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back and safe and sound. So he says, hey, your dad's having a party because your brother, the one that went off and spent all that his inheritance and all of that, he's come back to the house and your dad's celebrating. He's throwing this big party and everybody's dancing and they're feasting and they're having a good time. They're eating together. Look at this. Continue in the next verse. The older brother became what? Say that with me. The older brother became what? Angry. And he refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, never disobeyed your orders. You've never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. Oh, but when this son of yours, doesn't even recognize him as his own brother, right? This son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. It was as if he was upset that his brother even come back. Now, upset that he really didn't care that his brother was lost. He was just upset that he's come back and he's got more attention than him and all of these things. He's like, you did this for him and not for me. What's going on here? It's almost unbelievable to see a response from his brother, or is it? Is it unbelievable? Do we have the attitude as a church and as Christ followers, do we have the attitude of the Father, or do sometimes we get the attitude of the brother? And how we view things or how we see things. So I want to give you a couple of signs of this. Ask the person sitting beside you, say, hey, do you have OBS? Go ahead and ask them, do you have OBS? You're like, what is OBS? I looked this up, and I actually had somebody else look it up this morning even. I was like, hey, look up OBS and make sure this doesn't stand for anything before I use this illustration, because I have no idea. Like, what is OBS? Write this down. The older brother syndrome. The older brother syndrome. Do we sometimes get the older brother syndrome? Well, I want to give you two signs that will help identify if you and I have a heart that may be that we're struggling with the OBS, the older brother syndrome. So write these down. Number one is this: two signs that we may have it. And we need to continually check this. And I firmly believe we as a church do well with it, but I also think it's proper that we evaluate our hearts along the way, especially as we look into the future and make preparations as we invite people in, that we're reminded of that. So number one is this, write this down: self-righteousness is a characteristic of OBS. Self-righteousness is a characteristic of the older brother syndrome. I heard the story about this man who went to the doctor, and he said, doctor, you've got to help me. My wife can't hear worth a lick. Like, she can't hear and she won't come to the doctor. And he said, I tell you what, when you get home tonight, here's what I want you to do. Open the door and say, honey, what's for supper? And if she doesn't respond, walk into the living room and just yell it again. Honey, what's for supper? If she doesn't respond, go in the kitchen and say, honey, what's for supper? And if she still doesn't respond, walk directly behind her, right to the back of her head and her ear and say, honey, what's for supper? He said, and then maybe you'll help her realize she needs to come back in if that's the case. So he got home, opened the door. He said, honey, what's for supper? Crickets, right? Walks in the living room. Honey, what's for supper tonight? I'm hungry. What's for supper? No response. He goes in the kitchen. Honey, What's for supper? She still doesn't respond. He walks right up behind her in her ear and he says, honey, what's for supper? She turned around and said, for the 4th time I've told you spaghetti. Why do you keep asking? Who had the problem? He did, right? Doctor, she's got a problem. I'm telling you, she can't hear. Now, the whole issue the whole time was he couldn't hear. He was the one with the issue. And I share that to say when we deal with self-righteousness, it always points back to us, and we can always point and say, well, it's their fault, or look where I'm at compared to where they are, and I'm not. And in a moment, it's very easy for any of us in here, including myself, to become self-righteousness. And so we have to guard our hearts against that we don't get that OBS, that we don't get that older brother syndrome. In Luke 15:29, but he answered his father, look, at all these years, I've never disobeyed your orders. I've never done anything against you. And yet, I don't have that. It's pointing back that self-righteousness. Look at all the years. Look at all that I've done right for you. Now, remember the setting of this story, right? It wasn't for the tax collectors. It wasn't for the sinners that were there. It was for the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, those in the background that were muttering that he was even telling this whole story about the prodigal son, about the lost sheep, about the lost coin. It was the reason he was telling it was to teach them, to help them to be able to hear this story. Jesus tells another story in Luke 18. You don't have to turn over there, but he tells a story for everyone who feels pretty good about their religion. They feel pretty good about where they are. I do everything right. I go to church. I'm connected in discipleship, and I don't yell at my kids. I treat my spouse well. On and on and on. You could think of all these things for those that feel like they do everything right. And in chapter 18, verses 10 through 14, look at this. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like the other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. But he beat his breast and he said, God, have mercy on me because I'm a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be what? Say that with me. Humbled. But he who humbles himself will be what? Exalted. You and I have to constantly have a gut check to be reminded, to be careful that we're not living a self-righteous life, and how we view the lost, how we view people who are brokenhearted, how we view people who are far from God. Because we look at the story, both of these sons were technically lost in their relationship with their father in one way or the other. One was recognized it and went out and squandered all of it and recognized it, but the other one didn't even realize it. Didn't even realize where he was at in his relationship by the way he was viewing himself compared to others. And so you and I have to guard against this, because we can get in such a mindset, man, I come to church, I'm involved in discipleship, I give, or I serve, or I come this many times, man, I boycott Disney, or I'm not going to Target, I'm not going to Starbucks, and before you know it, you've got a whole list of everything you're against, but nobody really knows what you're for. You have to guard against the self-righteousness and be reminded of where you once were. The second sign, not only with self-righteousness, but we also have to guard ourselves against selfishness. That we're not selfish. And we look at the brother. What was he really saying? What he was saying was, what about me? Not just the righteousness that I've never done any of those things, but it was just over the fact that, what about me? You killed the fatted calf for him, but what about me? You throw this big party for him, but what about me? You have a celebration for him, but when will it be my turn? What about me? What do I get out of this? And the story that's told before this is the parable of the lost sheep, right? And what happens? The shepherd leaves the what? The 99 to go after how many? The one. He's willing to leave the 99 to go after the one that is lost. The one that needs help. The one that needs rescuing. And we have to be reminded that as we come together, man, we celebrate, we sing, and I love being here on Sunday mornings to worship with you. I love being here to be able to fellowship and share together. But while we come together to celebrate, we also have to be reminded that there's many people out there today, right now, that are not in here, that are not in any other church, that need the gospel, that need to be filling that seat, that need to hear the gospel, that need to be reached, that someone needs to share with them. And we have to get our mindset there. And here's why. I think that it's fairly hard to stop being the prodigal and not become the older brother. I'll say that again. I think it's fairly hard to stop being the prodigal and not start being the older brother. In other words, there's almost like a transition or a switch that happens when we're no longer the prodigal, that it's very attractional to become the older brother. I no longer do that. I've arrived. I'm now in this place. And so as a result, we have to continually evaluate our heart and our motives and where we are to be reminded of what Christ has done for us and what it is that He wants to do in other people's lives. And that is, He calls us to go and to reach those that are lost, to reach out to those that are far from Him, to go and make a difference. And so 2 things out of these 3 parables of the coin and the sheep and the lost boy, I want to give you 2 things out of those 3 parables. And it's this, 2 things that we must do. And here's what I want to challenge you with as we get ready for the next couple of weeks. We're going to talk about discipleship, and we're going to talk about some other things as well. Tom Rainer says that 95%, he's a guy that studies church, he says that 95% of the activities in a church tend to be for the members only, while only 5% are for those outside of the church. And so I share that with you as we look at these couple of points to be reminded of what it is that God's called us to do as a church in reaching the lost, reaching those in our statement who are far from God, to lead them to live for God, love people, and to serve the world. And so 2 things, write these down. Number 1 is this, is we have to reach, or we have to search would be the word. We search. It's time we start searching. Wherever we go, searching and looking. I was sharing with some of the guys this morning this story. Reuben Donnelly is in Chicago. It's the nation's largest printer of magazines. And they have a huge machine that sends out notifications to people whose subscriptions have expired. It was many years ago. But one of the springs broke in the machine, and it ended up sending one man in Powder Springs, Colorado, some rancher, it ended up sending him 9,734 notices that his subscription to National Geographic had expired. 9,734 notices. Do you know what he did? He went into town, and he sent them a letter in and paid it, and he said, "I give up, just send me the magazines." 9,000. That would be pretty messed up. But I share that to say, what did he finally do? He gave in and said, "Here, send me the magazines. I give up. I'll get the magazine." Now, you and I may not live our lives in that way, in that type of pursuit of people, but God does. God's constantly sending notifications to people over and over and over and over and over again, searching. And He calls us to do that. Luke 19:10 says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save save what was lost." And so if Jesus came to search, and He told us in the Great Commission to go and to search, then we have to do it. We have to be willing to search. We have to be willing to go. We have to be willing to go and reach those other people and to be willing to share with them. I want to read a scripture to you, one of the saddest scriptures in Ezekiel. Some of you may have read this before, in 34 verses 6. "My sheep wandered all over the mountains, and on every high hill they were scattered over the whole earth. and no one searched and looked for them. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty hard place to be. To imagine yourself stranded at sea and to be in a place where you're stranded and to have the realization perhaps that there's no one looking for me. Or to be in the mountains and to be stranded and be gone and to begin to think, is there anyone looking to rescue me? Is there anyone that's going to come help me? It's a tragic place to be. And so our world that we live in, our community, there's people who are hurting, there's people who are far from God, and we have to reach them. We have to search for them. We have to be willing to go and to look for them and to go share with them. And that happens outside of the walls of this church. And so I was reading some leadership material this past week from a friend, and he was talking about how we should be excited to come to church on the weekend, and sometimes even when we're serving, we may have to grind it. We're like, man, I gotta serve this weekend again and get connected, and I need to do this. And we get excited about the weekend, but we should be even more excited when we leave, because we're only here for an hour and 10 minutes. We should be more excited when we leave this place here in the next few minutes about doing something about what we've been challenged with versus just experiencing what we get to experience. Because when we get excited just about the experience and no excitement leaves with us, that's where we become the religious people of that time. Because then it becomes about us and what we get every week and what we hear, and we leave here and do nothing with it but just keep it to ourselves. That's where we get in danger. Therefore, we should be just as excited in those streets as we are in here, because that's who God's called us to be. And just to be reminded that God's called us to search. And then number two, very quickly, not only to search, but He's called us to attract. That we should attract people. The son realized, hey, it's better at home. I need to go back home. Let me ask you a question. And this is for us as a church that sincerely ask, for me to even ask as the pastor. When prodigals in our area are ready to come home, do they think about our church as a place that is safe? When people are ready to come home, what's the picture they get? What does that look like? It's interesting in this last parable, Jesus doesn't have the father go out and look for his son. You're like, man, if it was me, I'd be going out looking for my child. I'd be wanting to know where my son is. But in these two parables, the woman goes after the coin and the sheep goes after the shepherd. But in the third parable, the father never goes after the son. You say, well, why would the woman go after the coin or the shepherd go after the one lost sheep, but yet the father doesn't do anything? Because we know that we can send all the people in the world. We can send 9,734 notifications, but we won't get them until they come around. They have to come to themselves. And we understand that. But therefore, that's why we have to search, and then we have to attract. We have to attract them. We have to love on them and help lead them into that. We're dealing with people that they have a choice. And they have to be the one that makes that choice. And that's why it's important that we not only seek, but we attract. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in New York with a room full of people. And normally when I'm around people in this setting, I don't tell anybody I'm a pastor till the end. Because if I tell them up front, then the whole time I'm there, they treat me different. You know, they kind of don't want to, you know, people will, I'm going to be careful what I say or what I do because he's a pastor. And so the whole week I was there, or the few days I was there, I never told them I was a pastor. I tried to refrain from telling the group that till the end, and I had to get up and give a presentation. And when I sat down at the end, they had to evaluate it. And one of the individuals said, well, he's very sincere and authentic. And then the other person said, I really trust Benji. I trust him. And then there was someone from New Jersey that looked over and said, man, he sounds just like a preacher. Had no idea I was a preacher. So he just sounds like a preacher. And so I remained quiet. And at the end, I told him, I said, I am a pastor of a church, and was able to open up and share. But here's what it did. Before I began to present any of that, what had already happened? They trusted me. And then when they trusted me, I was able to talk. And they trusted me because I had started building the foundation. I didn't walk in day one and just try to, I'm against this and I'm against that and you're going to hell. And none of that. Walked in, built relationships, and then they trusted me, and I was able to share and talk. And so therefore, we have to be willing to attract, and the way that we attract is through love and building relationships. Everywhere Jesus went, he surrounded himself with sinners, but then how did he respond to them? The Samaritan woman, he made her feel loved, right? Zacchaeus climbs up a tree. What does he do? He makes him feel loved and welcomed. How did he treat these people? The woman caught in adultery, not the woman, not the rumor. No, she was caught in adultery. And how did he treat her? He loved her. Built the relationship. And then as a result, the life change happened. And so we have to guard ourselves against self-righteousness. We have to guard ourselves against selfishness. And then we have to begin to search, and we have to begin to attract, to be a city on a hill, to be different. So remember what happened. The prodigal son in the story wakes up, he realizes the situation, and what does he remember? Verse 17, let's look at that on the screen. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. When he came to his senses, he remembered a place that was home to him. And he realized it was a place that he could go back and be welcomed. And here's what I think, and here's where I want to land the plane and finish. I think many people in our culture try to turn around and go home to the Father, but they have a very hard time finding out where he lives. I think there's people that won't change, but they're trying to figure out, where does he live? Where do I go to find home? That statement there was the very reason this church was ever planted in Tifton, Georgia. It was because of the relationships we were building with people, and they were fit, and the response was, I don't know where I can go to be accepted, to feel at home. And that's why Journey Church was birthed to begin with. To a place that people could find home. And so as people in our culture begin to desire to change and they begin to look, it's my prayer that we would be a church that searches. We look for those opportunities, not to go in and storm in and try to create division, but we walk in and we build relationships and we bridge the gap and we love, and through that we're able to share the gospel and see life change. And so we search and we attract. And what does the Father do? He pulls out all the stops. Man, he throws the big party, right? He's like, kill the fatted calf, bring the sandals, bring the robe, bring the ring, bring all of these things in. We need to celebrate. 1 Corinthians 9:19 says, we're to be all things to all men that we might win some. We have to be willing to celebrate. We have to be willing to attract. We have to be willing to reach out. Luke 15:7 says this, I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. In other words, there's more rejoicing every time a sinner repents in our church than there is rejoicing in all the good that we're doing. Because it means that much. Verse 31, at the end here, my son, the Father said, he responds to his son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we need to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and he's alive again. He was lost, but now he's found. He says, you need to celebrate with me over this. You need to celebrate the fact that your son is now alive. You have these things. We need to celebrate. So we have to guard ourselves against the self-righteousness, but also to guard ourselves against the unrighteousness. For some of us in here, we may be on the side of saying, man, I've done too much. I've made too many mistakes. I've done some stupid things, and I'm unrighteous and to the point that God wouldn't accept me. But then there's others that may say, hey, I've done everything right, and I deserve to be here more than any other. And therefore, we have to guard ourselves against both. You can't be unrighteous enough to be out of His love, and you can't be self-righteous enough to be out of His love, because nothing can separate you from His love. So with every head bowed and every eye closed,